My father took me fishing as soon as I could negotiate the rocks, mostly on my own. But that's how I like to remember it. I was 4, and we were camping as a family at one of the sacred fly fishing only spots in the early 70s. My father hooked a fish and gave me the rod. Unbeknownst to me, I thought I had done it all. He coached me on how to bring it in and probably did most of the work. But what I remember very clearly is feeling pride and giddiness. I had caught a fish. He was an amazing sportsman. He could cast at great distance very accurately. He was an expert marksman with the rifle, pistol, and bow and arrow. I always felt my casting was inferior to his, and it embarrassed me. I didn't want to hear his feedback as a kid. Over the course of his life, my father took me on many, many fishing trips, helped me refine my casting, and guided me to proficiency in the art of fly fishing. However, there was a trip that he kept all for himself. Fall Steelhead on the Klamath. Fall on the Klamath River is like so many other rivers across the country. The fish are big, the sunsets are clear, and there is the smell of completion in the air. I grew up in a family of fly fishing zealots, whose mecca was the Klamath, and fall was time for the pilgrimage. Every year, my father, my uncles, and my papu would plan, shop, and take the trip of the year. They spent at least a week every fall casting on the sacred waters. As an adult, I moved to a town within 45 minutes of the Klamath. Not consciously, not because I had to be near it, but because there were so few people and so much wilderness. It seems obvious now that I had been tricked into it by so many years of stories and the mystique that had been built. Shortly after moving there, my father died. This both released me and indebted me to him. Let me explain. There are many that say that a man is not a man until his father is gone. I would agree. At first, I felt guilty for feeling free, but then I realized that no one had that kind of control over me. Not my uncles, not my mother, not my grandparents. I remember the day that I forgot what my dad smelled like. I forgot the sound of his voice, and could only imagine what it would be like for him to roughly massage my shoulders and tell me that he was proud of me like he would sometimes do. Of course, my mother let me have his fishing gear, and in it were the tools to chase steelhead, as well as most other fresh and some saltwater fish. Fly fishing was my solace, my therapy to feel good, and the last way to physically feel that closeness to my father. Needless to say, the Klamath River was a mythic place in my mind. It was a place that men went in all sorts of inclement weather and returned with big fish and even bigger stories. My first 5 years of steelhead fishing were not as mythic. It took a good year to learn how to use the shooting head. Since I was a bad combination of broke and proud, I didn't get any help or instruction. I just went out on the river and did my best to throw the heavy lead lines. The down and across drift was a bit strange, but I kept at it. I watched a video, read some dusty old books I took from my papu's library, and stayed with it. I caught nothing. They say steelhead are the fish of 1,000 casts. For me, my first steelhead was a fish of 1,000 trips. My break finally came in my 5th season of steelhead angling. I had a guide for the day and took my lady fishing. We would do some fly fishing and some bait fishing. Mostly, I wanted Susan to catch some fish. Anyway, I had given up on the idea of catching any myself. We met the guide, I got my rod set up and my waders on, and he ferried us across the river so I could cast while he set up the boat. On the second cast, I was retrieving my fly when my line went taut and there was a pulling at the end of it. It felt different than a snag, and I had hooked my first Klamath River steelhead. After all that time, it came down to a guide taking me to the other side of the river. Once I had hooked my first one, the others came consistently. Now it is a rare day that I don't catch and release at least a few steelhead. I've learned a great deal about this anadromous fish and their habits. Mostly, I have learned about a 12-mile section of river and how to fish it with a fly rod at different flows and conditions. I often have the sensation of being watched while I am fishing the Klamath. When I look up, there is no one there, no animals, no people. I like to think that they are watching me as my father, and I hear his words of support. Take your time, make a good cast, keep moving. I would love him to see me cast, and maybe he does. There are few feelings that compare to the sensation of a steelhead intercepting my fly in mid-drift. The fish hits, and something clicks in my brain, an unconscious response that happens in a fraction of a second to order my arm to pull back and set the hook. Often this results in a wild animal, a wild fish taking line from my reel. I focus on keeping my rod tip up and keeping tension in the line and an adequate amount of pressure on the fish. For a few moments, I am tied to that wildness, the sense of freedom that sometimes seems dormant during the long hours of work, traffic, and rules of culture. I reel in quickly, making the time that I play the fish as short as possible to make the odds of its survival as high as possible. So I move quickly once the fish is near me, wetting my hands so I don't disturb its protective slime, lifting the fish out of the water only if I have to. The few moments that I get to touch the fish are electric. I feel a sense of connection and brotherhood with it, and I enjoy watching it swim away with as much pleasure as I did in catching it. Through the years, and the hundreds of trips I've made to the Klamath, I've realized it's not just the fishing or the catching of the fish that I love, but it is the experience. From deciding to go, to tying my flies, to having a beer on the tailgate after a hard day of fishing. I love the experience of fishing, the feeling of closeness that it brings me to my father, long since departed, and the time hearing water move on rocks. I think I'm too young to be overly nostalgic, and I don't feel like it is the nostalgia that I crave, but the feeling of being alive.